to Michigan and bringing the Myeloma Crowd here. So let's give them, because this has really been one of my favorite meetings, because I got my best buds here, but also I really did learn a lot from talking to the other guys and seeing what they do. So I really am very thankful that the Myeloma Crowd came here today. I am going to talk about clinical trials, and I'm also going to talk about the definition of relapse and refractory myeloma. And part of the reason of that is that a lot of the clinical trials that we have are based on some type of, just like Brian had said, entry criteria. And so some of the definitions that I have up here of relapse myeloma is what is the basic entry criteria for clinical trials for relapse and refractory myeloma, because relapse and refractory myeloma clinical trials is really sort of the cutting edge of where the drug discovery and drug regimen discovery for myeloma comes from. So relapsed myeloma is when the disease comes back, usually after a period of remission or response. So people they're diagnosed, their M proteins are 4, they then go down to 0.1, it remains down at 0.1 for a period of time, and then when it begins to go from 0.1 to 0.6, then that is you went from the best response of 0.1 to being progressive or relapse or recurrent. And those terms are kind of superimposable, but I think that most of us used the word relapsed myeloma. And with therapy, thank goodness, and especially most recently, it's been incredible that the regimens that we have discovered in clinical trials have actually been able to have people have a second response after relapsed myeloma, which wasn't the case just 10 years ago. We would be lucky if we would get a 30% response rate in relapsed myeloma. And now, the other Craig showed us clinical trials using daratumumab where we have, 90% response rates for relapsed myeloma. So you can get a second and third and fourth response. Refractory myeloma is a little bit different in that that's when the disease has come back, and then when you start a treatment, you don't get a second response or a third response, that the disease becomes not responsive. People can have relapsed myeloma and then you try a drug and they can be refractory to a single drug. So sometimes we say that people are refractory to Velcade, meaning that they received a therapy for their myeloma. When their protein was low and it came back, you tried to use Velcade again and it didn't work. And so you're refractory to Velcade, but you use something like daratumumab and you respond again. Or you can be refractory where the disease, the myeloma, is refractory. And that's when the disease comes back and then you try treatment after treatment and then it doesn't respond at all to any of those treatments. And that's when people have refractory disease. So there's a difference between refractory to a drug. You can be refractory to any drug, but then there are other options to pick from. And then you can be refractory where the disease can be refractory, where refractory again meaning not responsive. And some people who are newly diagnosed with myeloma, when they start their first therapy, RVD or VRD, and they don't respond to that first treatment, I mean usually 90+ % of people who are newly diagnosed respond to their first treatment. Some people, that minority who doesn't respond, we call primary refractory. And that is a real interest of clinical trials in order to try and bring up the response rate to 100% so that we don't have primary refractory disease. Does that make sense, I hope? The difference between there's relapse when the disease comes back, but you start another regimen and it responds. And then there's refractory where the disease comes back and you try a drug and it doesn't respond. You're drug refractory. And then there's refractory myeloma where you don't respond. And that's where the cutting edge, again, of clinical trials is pointed at the refractory patients. Relapsed, so how do you know if someone how do you know if you have relapsed disease? And basically, it's when the protein begins to go up. And the 25% increase from best response is said a lot, where we say that, if your protein goes up from your best response, if it was 0 and it goes up by up to 25%, then that it's increased. We use a lot of the 0.5, and there's a lot of trials that will say a 0.5 gram per deciliter increase in the best response. So again, if you got your initial therapy, your protein went down to 0.1, and it starts to go up to 0.6, then that would be progressive disease, or that is the point of a serologic relapse. People can feel perfectly fine with their protein going up. And there can be times, just like Dr. Hoffmeister had mentioned, that sometimes how fast it goes up can be very indolent. I've had patients that have taken 2 years to relapse. We were waiting for him to go on a clinical trial, and his protein went up to 0.2, 0.3, then 0.2, then 0.3, and months and months and months went on before actually the clinical trial he was looking to get on closed, because by the time that he actually got to the point of having 0.6, the trial was closed. But also, he didn't really need therapy because it took such a long time for his protein to go up. Other people have different kinetics where their disease comes back from 0.2 to 2 in just a few weeks. And those patients, just like Craig had mentioned, really do need an aggressive and quick response. And those patients who don't produce a protein, we look at the bone marrow percentage, and when we look at light chains, we look at the difference between, you look at the involved light chain going up by 10 milligrams per liter or per liter. Not all patients, again, that have an increase in their M protein or a biochemical relapse need therapy. And asymptomatic, we have a lot of patients who their protein goes up very slowly. We check to make sure they don't have any new bone disease, no anemia, no Crab symptoms, and we can watch them actually for quite a while. But when they really do have relapse disease, when they start to develop symptoms, then you definitely need to treat. Or if the protein is going up very quickly, then again it's time to treat. One thing I like to tell people and that I talk to my patients about is that usually we're using one test to make this decision if someone has relapsed disease or not. And I would not let one test basically, run your entire life. It is a much more thoughtful, it's not as automatic as saying, gosh, the protein has gone up by 0.5, it's now relapse. We take into context, A, that this is a test. We have to check it a couple times over before we make any decision. And how do you feel? Again, we've had patients that have taken years to relapse, and we've had patients that have taken just a few weeks to relapse. So you have to watch it very carefully, but it's more than just the M protein. It really is putting into context of other symptoms and signs. Does that make sense, I hope? I like Grumpy Cat, especially after I eat. I get kind of grumpy. And clinical trials are very good, though. And we're going to talk a bit about clinical trials. The whole point of clinical trials is to improve the effectiveness of therapy and get rid of the side effects of different treatments. And when we started out in myeloma, one of the first clinical trials that was done in myeloma was using urethane, which is a poison. Urethane is a plant killer. It was the standard of care for myeloma for about 20 years. Based on personal experience of doctors back in the 50s, I should say. There was in a clinical trial that randomized patients between the standard of care, urethane, versus Coca-Cola, which is Coca-Cola. What do we have today, Pepsi or Coke? Pepsi. Okay, Pepsi, okay, but you could use Pepsi. So the urethane studies, urethane as the standard of care for myeloma was based on the experience of two patients responded to urethane, and it was the standard of care for 20 years. Then the first randomized study was done, randomizing between urethane and Coca-Cola, and who do you think won? Coca-Cola won. Why? Because urethane is poison. Poison is a plant killer. It's not good for people. And it was only the experience of two patients. And that was the biggest problem, is that you need to have true, thorough clinical trials in order to establish a new standard of care. So Coca-Cola was a standard of care for a whole 5 minutes. And then there came melphalan and prednisone. Melphalan and prednisone didn't have as much activity, had quite a bit, had some toxicity. It was a clinical trial. And then when it was put up against the standard of care, it won. So melphalan and prednisone becomes the standard of care. Then we go to other types of chemotherapy. And clinical trials, as you see, bit by bit, that clinical trials become less toxic and more effective. And now we're into where these steps are, in fact, I don't have a font small enough to show how the standard of care now is coming, clinical trial standard of care, clinical trial standard of care. It is coming fast and furious, where now the toxicities are much lower than they used to be, and the standard of care is quickly being replaced, and they're being more effective. We're now talking about response rates of like 99%, 100%. I mean, and back in the day, that was almost unheard of having responses that high. So given the current velocity, it is only a matter of time before we hit the cure button, but before we hit a cure, but we need to make sure that we know that we get there. The incredible thing is that I was really uncomfortable with this slide. I've used this slide for about 5 years. 5 years ago, I was really uncomfortable with this slide because so few myeloma doctors were saying the word cure. Now everyone says it, which is really exciting, that everyone now has it on their lips as something that now we see as something with all the technology and how quickly the standard of care and clinical trials are going. It really is sort of an inevitable result of what we're doing. Does that make sense about how clinical trials go into ultimately cure? So one thing that was kind of interesting is that when we asked myeloma patients about what they felt about clinical trials, so Dr. Hoffmeister had mentioned that not a lot of patients in the United States with myeloma are on clinical trials. Well, the Cancer Experience Registry for Myeloma actually asked 450 myeloma patients, what about you, what do you think about clinical trials? And this is what they thought about clinical trials. So again, these patients were primarily women. They were primarily more than 4 years from their diagnosis. And they were primarily, half were transplanted, half were not transplanted. And in this group of patients with myeloma, the top 3 concerns that they had about clinical trials was being randomized, so we're going to talk about that, receiving a placebo, we'll talk about that, and fear of side effects, we'll talk about that. That is 60%, the majority of patients were worrisome about, and that was part of their barriers to be on clinical trials. There were other concerns, including guinea pig, which is down at 13%, which should be at 0 at all. And 52% of patients had received information on clinical trials, and 35% were not sure if a clinical trial is available to them. So a lot of patients just kind of brushed it off, even if they hadn't received any information for it, that they were not going to be eligible. So let's talk about being randomly assigned. or about placebo. So one myth about clinical trials is that you'll receive a placebo, and that's a myth. In cancer clinical trials, when we do a randomization, it's randomized. It is only ethically, it is, I should say, against the law to randomly assign you to something that doesn't work. In the United States, if there's a randomization, you get randomized to the current standard of care, or you're randomized to the standard of care plus the investigational drug. They can't, if you have active myeloma, they can't give you a placebo Revlimid because that's against the law. That's called battery. You can't do that. But if the standard of care, like for smoldering myeloma, if the standard of care is observation, which is what the standard of care is for smoldering, you may receive a placebo versus a treatment drug because the standard of care is observation. So, but you cannot do, if you have cancer, you cannot be given a placebo unless the standard of care is doing nothing at all. Otherwise, you will receive the best available treatment, or you'll receive the best available treatment plus something else. Does that make sense, I hope? Otherwise, Jeff and I would be in prison. And I do not look good in orange. If that's what they still use in prison, I have no idea. I just watch TV shows. So if my doctor doesn't mention it, then there's no clinical trial for me, and that is an absolute myth. That your doctor may not be aware of clinical trials, and that's why I think the Sparks Cure thing is just awesome. I have played around with that website quite a few times. I've entered it as an 18-year-old woman and found my clinical trials at University of Michigan. I have gone in as a one-legged 80-year-old woman and found, believe it or not, and I found my clinical trials again. And it was very easy. And so I would highly recommend that you try that. Even if you're not ready even if you think you're not eligible for a clinical trial, you may be eligible for a clinical trial, because in 2017, we just don't have clinical trials for refractory myeloma anymore. We now have clinical trials for smoldering, we have clinical trials for maintenance therapy, clinical trials for transplant, all the way down the continuum of myeloma. There are now clinical trials that are coming out. And so you may not be eligible today, but you may be eligible for the future. But being knowledgeable, having that tool in your hand is powerful, because then you can use that tool whenever you want if you know about the clinical trials. So if your doctor may not be aware of it, you are now empowered to look for it yourself and tell your doctor that you are eligible for a clinical trial. The trial is more important than the patient. Absolutely not. We all use clinical trials as a tool to deliver superior therapy. Why do I do clinical trials? It's not for personal fame, and definitely not for fortune. It is because I want to deliver the best care for my patients. And I know that, as far as I know, I don't know anything else about any other cancer, but in myeloma land, I know that the best available therapy is in clinical trials, which is why I offer clinical trials to my patients. And I tell them that when you get a consent form for a clinical trial, you're not getting married to anybody. I'm not marrying you when you sign a clinical trial. That would be polygamy. That's also against the law. If you sign a consent form for a clinical trial, you can leave that clinical trial at any time that you want. No one will be mad at you. There is no repercussion for doing that. Sometimes I tell patients, this is a clinical trial, but I really don't know if this is the right one for you. And they can sign it, and sometimes they want to go through with it, but they can leave any time that they want for any reason that they want. And sometimes it's because we find another clinical trial that's better. And so you are not married to the clinical trial, and definitely patients are the center of clinical trials. And then the big thing is that if I'm in a clinical trial, I'll be a guinea pig. That is a falsehood. There are no guinea pigs. See, I give you, guinea pigs are cute. They smell funny, and we have had guinea pigs in our home, but you will not be a guinea pig. And the reason is that A, there are multiple safeguards to maintain the safety of clinical trials, not only at the institution, which has a review board that looks at all the clinical trials and repeatedly looks at the clinical trials. The FDA examines clinical trials. And they, as you saw from Dr. Hoffmeister talking about the checkpoint inhibitor trials, if the FDA smells trouble, they close down the trial. And they can close down a trial in a day if there is any safety concerns. Clinical trials are more safe today than I have ever seen. And we are extensively trained in clinical trials. We have to take a test, because that's once a year. We have to take the peer certification to know how to do clinical trials. And we have to do an education yearly to be aware of bias in clinical trials and in all the problems that had happened in the past with abuses. So clinical trials are safer now more than ever. And I guess one other little fact is that there was a time about 7 years ago that I would go to the big hematology meeting, and I would go to booth of all the drug companies begging them to please think about myeloma for a clinical trial. And I would say, would you think about doing a clinical trial with us? Now it is completely different. I get emails about twice a week on saying, would you want to participate in a clinical trial? Do you want to participate in a clinical trial? Clinical trials are rapidly expanding for myeloma because of all the success that has happened in myeloma research. People don't want to do research with people that lose. People want to do research with people that win, and myeloma has been winning solidly for the past 5 years. So the clinical trials are expanding rapidly. So now we can pick and choose what we want to do. So if a drug company says, I want to do a clinical trial with this drug that causes neuropathy, I say, no, I'm not going to give my patients neuropathy again. Go back, take that junk home, and I'll pick another clinical trial. Or if something is particularly exciting, like the antibody drug conjugates, I say that's what we want to be involved in. That's the clinical trial that we want. So now with the plethora of clinical trials, we're able to pick and choose what we want to do and pick and choose things that are best for our patients. So the chances of being a guinea pig on anything, it doesn't exist. That clinical trials are safer and more exciting than ever. This is a embarrassingly limited number of trials that are available in multiple myeloma. I have it broken down by the different types of targets. Again, we have clinical trials that are directed towards the 17p high-risk patients, the FGFR3 mutation. There is the heat shock proteins. There's cyclin kinase, HDAC inhibitors. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And so there are a lot, and this is incomplete. So there are more and more clinical trials. And somewhere in here, probably somewhere that's not in here, but something that is probably brewing right now in the brain of an 18-year-old biochemistry major, or maybe 29-year-old biochemistry major, is going to be on this list next. And it is, again, very exciting. So now, again, if you look at pancreatic cancer, I don't know of a lot of trials going on pancreatic cancer because unfortunately, that disease has not been very treatable. ALS, terrible disease, raised a lot of money. Again, the application of that lot of money couldn't be there because they really don't have a target. I wish they could find something, but they don't. Myeloma, now's the time to be empowered with information to talk to your doctor about what options do I have, because there are more options now than there ever has been, and it's growing. So make sure that you are an informed patient. Ask your doctor, what is the goal of the treatment? What are the best options for me? And what's the best therapy for me? Because it's just not 2 drugs that we have to work with anymore. We have a whole arsenal of different drugs. What I tell people is that if you don't understand what I say, ask me again. The hospital, anybody hospital administrators here? Okay, I can say what I want. So, no, the hospital's like, see patients, see more patients, see more patients, hurry, hurry, see more patients. And they're like pushing and pushing. They put patients in rooms like an hour earlier to try and get me to move faster. And that is the way that the healthcare is in 2017. They're trying to push us faster to see more patients, which means that if you have a question, stop me. Or if you have a question for your doctor, stop them. Say, wait, I don't care how quickly you are supposed to be moving today, you're going to sit down and talk to me about my cancer, about my clinical trial, about what are my options. And that's really important, because otherwise these guys, and including myself, will keep on going. So be empowered to stop us. If you have a question, ask again. Ask yourself, what are my personal goals, and do I have the information that I need to make an informed decision? Make sure you bring people with you. Make sure you bring people with you to listen. Because I find that when I go to the doctor, I don't listen at all. I'm just trying to get the hell out of my doctor's appointment. So bring someone with you to listen, to help you make that decision and talk about it. Take an active role in decision making for yourself. I think that's because now is the time to do that with all the options and the exciting world of myeloma that we have today. Slow down there. Thank you.